Welcome to the Wiggly Podcast. Isn't it great when we get listeners phoning in on the farm phone?
Well, that is the idea, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, this week we've got Neil Foley who phones in. Neil Foley, also known as Pod Chef, he's a chef in Washington State. He describes himself as an outspoken podcasting chef, sustainability advocate and farmer.
He lives on an island, doesn't he?
He does. And so over to Neil. I'm pleased as punch to have got hold of Pod Chef, who's contributed to loads of Wiggly shows in the past. So welcome, Neil.
Thank you very much, Heather.
Tell me all about what you do, because I've seen and listened to several gastrocasts, and I'm not sure that all our audience will have joined in yet.
Well, I bill myself as a podcasting chef, sustainability advocate, and farmer. And I am all three of those things. I run a small business called the Kitchen Garden Company, which ostensibly set out to be a catering business, but because I didn't get enough catering money to pay the bills, I branched out into numerous other things.
And where are you?
I live on a tiny island off the west coast of Washington State, USA.
Wow. What's the weather like there, darling?
It's been absolutely appalling. We've just suffered our fourth gale this winter.
Oh, no.
Already.
So who do you get to cook for? I mean, that must be your day job, is it?
Well, I wish. I actually am a freelance chef, so I do quite a lot of interesting jobs cooking for single dinner parties here and there, or catering. Like last year about this time, I was gearing up to cater for a family for an entire week, where I lived with them and cooked for them and their guests.
Wow.
I do quite a lot of private chefing and dinner parties here and there. Occasionally I cater the large wedding and such.
And what about your farm?
My farm is very small at the moment because we haven't the land. We used to have quite a few cattle and sheep, and we were able to graze our animals on public land. And about 10 years ago, we lost that right. So we got rid of the animals and kind of reduced ourselves just to a handful of chickens. And I was busy off doing other things. And it's only recently that we've made a pasture and are starting to slowly increase with a couple of calves and some sheep in addition to the chickens. But we kind of raise all that stuff on top of our own veg and a bit of gardening like that. Just to, the chickens are for eggs and meat. And because we live on an island, if we want to have anything fresh at all, we really have to raise it ourselves.
So this island, how far is it from the mainland, and how do you get from A to B, etc.?
Well, we're about 20 miles out, and we take a ferry that comes in several times a day. It's about an hour-long ferry ride to the mainland. It's getting more and more expensive, so we only go in, once every 2 weeks. Maybe in the winter when the weather is bad as it's been, we might not get in once a month.
And what's the population there?
We're on an island in the center of an archipelago, and our tiny island only has about 500 full-time residents. There's a number of holiday cottages and second homes where people will come. So in the summer it swells quite a bit more. We're not the smallest inhabited island by far, but we're not the largest. There's some with, I think, the next largest island to the south of us, which is 10 minutes away by boat, has about 10,000 residents.
And so are the islanders used to self-sufficiency? Is it, are you in fashion, or is it a way of life?
For the most part, it's always been a way of life, and those of us who live here year-round have adopted that way of life. And some islands are more self-sufficient because they don't even have ferry service. You have to go in by boat or plane, and that's where the really hippie, true organic farmers inhabited first because it was so far away, so hard to get to. No electricity, no telephones. We're rather modern. Our electricity came to this island in 1962, I think. And so we're quite upscale.
Well done. Now, you and I have exchanged various emails on the state of British and US beef, and even you've kindly done for us a blog on your top 5 Wiggly moments on the podcasts.
Yeah.
And one of those issues, several of those issues are to do with the way that we source and connect back with our meat and our food. Can you tell me a bit more about your views on this subject?
Well, I think it's incredibly important to know where your food comes from and how it's raised. Not only for terms of quality, because certainly I think it's been proven that that well looked after, well cared for, happy, if you want to say, meat or animals provides much better meat and more flavorful, but also because in America, for example, our food generally travels 1,500 miles from point A to your dinner table. That's kind of a national average.
Yeah.
And that is going to, not only because of the increasing cost of fuel and global warming and all the other issues, food's just going to get more expensive if it has to travel that distance. So we need to decentralize the food system and get to where we have community food sources, where the farmer down the road, back to the olden days, like, maybe, but what other countries and are already doing is to have the food raised somewhere where where you can actually go visit and see the operation. Because right now in the States, we only have 4 slaughterhouse, packing house facilities in the country that are large, and all our meat comes from there. And there's just some horrendous abuses, not only in terms of the quality of the butchering and the livestock, but also in terms of the employees, because they're forced to work slavishly long hours for next to nothing. It's a bit medieval, in fact, in this modern day.
But shouldn't people just be able to go into their supermarket and know where that beef has come from? Do they really need to reconnect so closely? Some people would say, well, I don't want to get to know the cow because, it's going to be dead.
Well, I don't know that they have to know the cow per se, but if they know the farmer or the producer who raises their food, and that's not impossible just to go into the local supermarket and do that. And there are some places in the United States where that is happening on a very micro scale. And certainly I go to a food cooperative that largely sells organic produce and meats, and the food that they source in season is locally raised. So I don't necessarily have to know who grew it, but I know that I could know them. I could actually call them up. Their carrots are grown on such and such farm, and here's their contact information. So I think that's happening, and I think more and more that is what's required. Not that the consumer actually has to go out and do the work themselves, but that somebody does. As
a professional chef, can you prove that locally produced or fresher food actually tastes better?
Yeah, I would say it does. I don't know if there's an actual scientific way of registering it on some kind of scale, but certainly for certain things, the quicker you eat the food, the better. So take peas, for example. Fresh green peas in season are always better straight out of the garden than if they're picked, are loaded onto a truck, transported to the market, and 2 days later you eat them. Yes, they're still fresh, but they're not going to have that vibrancy. And magnify that times, a week of being in travel. The tomatoes right now in the States are grown for transportation. They're appalling. And certainly the ones right now are the same as the ones you could buy at the height of tomato season during the summer. They're going to be hard and don't taste as good. But if you go to a local farmer's market and you buy some heirloom variety tomatoes or something that's ripe and in season, the flavor is just going to blow you out of the water. It's just going to be so tremendous. And it might even be too much flavor for you at first because it's just going to be such a revelation. The closer we are to our food source and the smaller the distance it travels, I think the fresher and better flavor things will be.
Now, I don't expect a complete history of the U.S., but when we went to Tennessee, we noticed very much that, you couldn't help but notice that the crop of the moment in just about everywhere, was cotton. And although there was a little bit of soybean interspersed in amongst it, for miles and miles there was just cotton. How did that come to be, and how do you see that changing if it's going to over the next few years?
Well, unfortunately, in America, the state of agriculture, the main cash crops that I'd say 75% of the farmers grow are corn, soybeans, and cotton. And it's not they make a tremendous amount of money because they don't. Corn and soybeans are sold at 40% under cost of production. So it's all government subsidies back up the rest. And the reason there's so much of it, the reason it extends for miles and miles and miles, and in Tennessee it's going to be cotton, in Iowa it's going to be corn, in Missouri it'll be corn, cotton, or soybeans. The reason there's so much of it is because the farmers have got to keep acres and acres of land under cultivation just because they have to get that extra bushel to make that extra couple cents. And so this monocropping system has sort of grown out of the global market for these items. As the pressure holds the price down, the farmers have to grow more and more and more and try and recoup some kind of money from the system.
And so is your special situation because the transportation to your island is so expensive? Is that what makes this whole concept there economical, or is there other factors at play?
Well, for me, it's more a choice because I enjoy the closeness to my animals and the freshness and everything. And because for one of the things, I live just a minute's walk away from a raw milk dairy. Now, you can't buy raw milk in most of the states. In fact, probably anywhere really these days. And they have a license to sell it, and they've never had a problem in 25 years' existence. Yeah. I mean, that sort of special microclimate is kind of fostered by the fact that we're insular, we're out here away from everything. Sure, on some of the bigger islands, there are grocery stores and supermarkets, and the stuff is trucked in, and it is slightly more expensive to buy it, and you can buy the commercially mass-marketed things just as easily as on the mainland. But I think that the kind of climate that we're in out here, we're very much closer to the Skagit Valley of Washington State is on the mainland. It is an incredibly rich, fertile valley, and there's so much produce grown there for actually the rest of the nation. Potatoes and broccoli and a lot of the seed companies where you go buy your seed mixes for cabbages and broccolis and things, all that takes place just 20 miles away on the mainland. And in fact, tulips, huge tulip fields. And the funny thing is, the tulips are harvested here, shipped to Holland, packaged, and sold as Dutch tulips.
Oh, no!
They're actually grown here. I mean, you can buy a packet at the local garden center on the mainland, and it says, you know, packaged in Holland, grown in Washington State. So it's one of the biggest scams. But there you have that transportation issue back and forth.
Yeah, that's amazing.
It's one of the largest scams ever. Very smart Dutchman.
Now, how did you come to listen into the Wiggly Podcast and tell me about what you've been up to with bokashi, which is really what I wanted to ask you about?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure what my very first exposure to Wigglies was. I don't know whether I was just skimming through iTunes.
Yeah.
Or
farming.
or whether I got you from Lloyd Davis or somebody else from the UK podcast scene who I listened to. But somehow I clicked on, one of your 5th or 6th episodes, and I was hooked immediately.
That's what we like to hear.
Yeah, I mean, the whole concept of what you're doing is so addictive, I think. And by the way, this week's show definitely should go up on my top 5.
Oh my God, it's so funny.
I listened to it this morning, and it was just absolutely right on. Not only is it the things I'm interested in, the sheep and the bokashi and the farming aspect of things, but just the mix. And that's really what, that captivated me at first, because you hadn't done the bokashi and all the rest of it. So I just sort of, listened. And now I look forward to it every single week. And then about a year ago, I think, or a little bit more than a year ago, you did the bokashi episode.
Yeah.
And that was a revelation. I heard you say it. I went to the Wiggly website and looked up the bokashi buckets and kind of learned as much as I could there. And then I hit the internet and just Googled it. And what I found was, for America, there isn't that much information out on bokashi. But you had really, in that one episode, the very first episode on it, had done such a great job of portraying it and its usefulness that once I did a bit of research, I was instantly swayed. And I think 2 months later, by February, I was set up with my own bokashi set up and actually getting ready to start selling it myself.
That's fantastic. And you've got the most wonderful set of photos and descriptions of what you've done with your bokashi.
A video, too, of making the bokashi.
So cool.
That I've done. And I just think it's so amazing. I mean, it's almost too good to be true.
I know.
I mean, there's so much. I've imported a couple of Japanese magazines that have been translated to English that are pure propaganda for bokashi. But really, if you look into it and my practical experience, I just thought, well, I'll get started. I'll see what this does. And my first inclination with it was this would be so tremendous for the restaurant industry. I can't tell you how many restaurants I've worked in where every day we throw 55-gallon pail of vegetable and scrap away, just in the dumpster to be hauled off to the landfill.
Yeah.
And that has always bothered me. I mean, because I live on a farm, we have a completely cyclical relationship. Our food scraps, vegetable peelings, compost either goes out to the garden as compost or it goes to the chickens, and the chickens give us back eggs and meat, and, the cycle goes around.
Yeah.
And so with the restaurant waste, I just couldn't believe how much we ended up throwing away each week. And so I immediately saw bokashi as a way of composting all that restaurant scrap and getting it back into the land and being a valuable asset. Because right now with the monocropping in America, and even if a young couple want to go buy a farm and get set up on some sort of organic or semi-organic growing setup, the land has been so depleted and so stripped away of the valuable nutrients in the topsoil that we really need the injection of the microbial life and the added nutrients that bokashi offers.
And what's the resistance?
A couple things. Farmers, especially organic farmers, are a little slow on the uptake. They're afraid about bringing anything into their farm that isn't from their farm or that they know about. I mean, once I've sold several people bokashi systems, and they're absolutely thrilled by them once they grasp it and see the usefulness. But to get an established farmer and get that input onto their land, they don't see that. In fact, a biodynamic farmer, who I thought would really appreciate the whole thing, he was worried about, what if all those things going into the bokashi bucket weren't organic to begin with and full of, all kinds of whatever.
But it's pickled, me dear.
I know, and the amazing thing with bokashi and the effective microbes is they can actually transform toxins and heavy metals into beneficial things, or at least not toxic anymore, but neutral. So I just think it's the most brilliant thing ever. And so I just, I heard it on your show. I got it set up. I did a couple of experiments in the spring last year, February and March, and I was so amazed that when I went to till my garden after I'd buried bokashi piles around it for, a few months earlier, that it was completely gone. It would just disintegrate it into this wonderful black soil. That just bowled me over. And so I put in a polytunnel that was on it had been lawn. And so I stripped off all the turf and dug it up and put in some compost and some things to bulk up the soil. But a lot of it was bokashi. And the tomatoes I grew on the side of the polytunnel that had the bokashi compost in it were more vibrant, healthier, larger, more root system than on the other side. And that, during the summer, that really convinced me of the whole benefit of it.
And then I think you started feeding your chooks with bokashi and had an incident with a sheep.
I was grazing Cotswold weather on the lawn outside our house just to get it used to the electric fence. And I had, in that same area, had a little portable pen with some chickens in it. And I'd been feeding the bokashi at about 5% of the normal grains that I supplement my chickens with. And I've been mixing that in, and it makes they don't smell. I mean, that's the killer thing is, if you feed your livestock bokashi, their excrement doesn't smell anymore. Mm-hmm. And so I had the chickens in this electric fenced area with the sheep, and he got whiff of the bokashi and went berserk for it. He practically trampled the chicken house to bits trying to get at the bokashi.
Really?
And so I had to start feeding him bokashi as well. And I just noticed today, I was actually out in one of the chicken houses, and it's only got about 30 hens in it, and it's really starting to get ripe. It's really smelling, even though it's very cold outside right now.
Yeah. But
I'm in between batches of bokashi, and I haven't been feeding it to them. And so where I had no smell through the heat of the summer, now that I'm not feeding it to them on a semi-regular basis, the odor's starting to increase.
Oh, I think that's one of the things that we found here is even if you neglect the job for a little while, you can still recover the situation when you add bokashi back, which is amazing.
Yeah, it's just phenomenal.
So your sheep, do you think there's any other benefit for the sheep except for the fact he really likes it?
I haven't got it proof for myself, but there's a number of online studies of bokashi, mainly from the third world, surprisingly enough, where, I mean, bokashi is relatively new to me. I mean, I only heard about it last year. I don't know exactly when you heard about it, but it's been around since the early 90s.
Yeah.
And so the third world has done all the studies, chickens, pigs, goats, everything, all kinds of livestock, and not just the bokashi itself, but the actual microbial inoculant that makes the bokashi. I've heard of or read about farmers who take sickly calves with a scour or something and then dump a gallon of the effective microbe solution down them once in a while, and that seems to clear it up.
Yeah.
So, I haven't done anything that dramatic myself, but I do know that the whole premise, if their digestive system is working and those microbes are in there and the flora and fauna are on a correct balance, then, the whole health of the animal is going to be better. And not only that, but once the bokashi makes its way through and out the back end, that manure is going to compost quicker and digest and be beneficial to the pasture. So you can't go wrong in feeding your cattle or your sheep bokashi, I think.
Do you feed yours wet or dry?
I feed it wet because I only just recently during the summer purchased a dehydrator large enough to try and dry it. But I find that if I stagger my batches, I can feed it wet without it spoiling.
Yeah, because that's the worry, isn't it, I suppose?
Yeah, the funny thing is, I did have a batch go with that white mold.
Yeah.
That's supposedly normal. And I was a little nervous to feed it to the chickens, because, chickens are sensitive to molds. But I took it and I said, well, here's some scruffy old roosters, and not that I wanted to poison them, but I figured they would be the trial experiment. And they ate it all and then some. I mean, they were thrilled, and nothing happened to them. So I can only imagine that mold is beneficial.
I would love to see chickens as guinea pigs as the trial, and also thrilled chickens I have yet to see. But I love the image of it.
Oh, I did have one batch that went a little further and got moldy. I think the white filament mold isn't actually a mold. It's actually a type of bacteria.
Right.
That's beneficial. It's a type of soil bacteria. And a lot of people are put off by, their bokashi bucket going moldy. And I think that, when it's that fuzzy white mold, that's perfectly normal. But when it goes green or that kind of funky bread moldy type mold, then I just go out and bury it in the garden.
Yeah.
I have had the tail end of a batch go that way. Now, I did try another interesting experiment that I learned from the third world, which was called bokashi balls.
Oh, yeah, to put in your pond, is it?
Yeah, you take mud and you mix the bokashi with it, some extra molasses and effective microbe solution, and you let them ferment and get quite moldy. And I was trying to clear up a kind of a bloom in my pond.
Yeah.
I couldn't see through to the fish. And so I put several of those in there. Now, I can't say for sure whether it did the job, because in the pond it was very difficult to tell. The water was murky anyway, but the fish seemed to thrive. They're still there and healthy. But I did a controlled experiment outside the pond with some pint jars of liquid, and I put the bokashi ball in one and some EM ceramics in another and some effective microbe solution in another, and I left another as a control. And the EM ceramics actually did the best job of clearing up the whatever bloom was in the water. But the bokashi ball seemed to do okay, but, the mud in it made it a bit murky.
Yeah, I think that this EM ceramic, there's no doubt in my mind it works, but I'm still not entirely sure how.
Yeah, I have no idea. I've heard your interview with the fellows in the Netherlands, I think, who explained it, and that was just a bit crazy. And I've read explanations from someone who's equally as crazy here in the States. I'm not a scientist, and I'm not a mystic, so I don't want these far-out, wacky explanations. I just want an explanation that works.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And I think the best one that makes sense is, I read this in a Japanese publication, they've been making water storage jugs for years out of this clay that's fermented in these mines. And the water seems to taste better and last longer, fresher in these jugs. They've been making them for centuries. So the theory is with the ceramics, the microbes are actually, when they die in the clay, they leave their shape. And so that information is in there, that pattern or whatever makes the bacteria do its job is left in the little void in the ceramic that it leaves. And that's, that makes some kind of sense anyway, so that even if it's cooked off at a high temperature to fire these ceramic beads, that they have that capacity, or that's the same as the bacteria did once upon a time.
I think it's still going to be beyond me, but I do know it keeps Monty's fish tank clear. And we have lots of customers who are very enthusiastic about those ceramics. So what can you say? That's it, really, isn't it?
I finally put 2 bags of the Bokashi beads in my pump filter for the pond.
Yeah.
And it just keeps it clean. I mean, it helps keep that funny algae bloomy stuff down.
Now, you mentioned to me a book that you recommend us reading, and I want to ask you about your book, because, if I was Parkinson, this is what I'd go on to, the book. So, what was the name of the book we must read?
It's called The Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan, and he's an investigative journalist who writes for the New York Times, I think.
And that was in particular reference to our shooting podcast, I think.
Yeah, he has at the very end of the book, it's basically a book in 4 meals. He traces the ethical and moral choices that we have to make about our food supply in this day and age, and he traces the completely fast food meal that's 100% raised on grain, the beef eats a corn diet, there's corn in almost every part of that fast food meal, and he kind of traces the history of how we became so cornified in America. And then he traces 2 different organic meals. One is an organic meal that's raised completely on an organic, biodiverse farm, and the third meal is a kind of industrial organic meal that he buys at a Whole Foods organic market. And the final meal is one that he forages for, and he goes out and learns how to forage for mushrooms, and he also decides in order to tackle this, he must hunt and kill an animal. And that was really the most amazing chapter for me, because in order to tackle the whole issue of whether eating meat and killing meat yourself, hunting is moral, he had to become a vegetarian for a while to see it from the opposite side. And it really does an amazing, in the end, he justifies the case for hunting and eating meat and killing it and knowing where it comes from. But he really displays the full range of emotions and writes quite well about his guilt. In fact, after he kills the boar that he hunts and kills, he was so elated that he killed it. But afterwards, on seeing the photo of himself standing over it kind of as a trophy, he felt an immense amount of guilt and shame that he felt so good about taking the life of this animal. And he kind of sums it up by feeling that it's not so much that he was happy that he killed it, but that he'd actually set out and accomplished what he was set out to do, which that day was to hunt and shoot an animal that he would eventually eat and respect with a fantastic dinner.
Yeah.
So I think that anybody who raises their own food or wants to raise their own food or has questions or wants to know more about food should really read that book.
We'll do that.
We don't have a Hugh Fernley-Whittingstall in our country.
HFW.
HFW, you got it.
Historic Fort Worth.
Yeah, good old HFW doesn't exist in our country unless it's the people like Michael Pollan or myself who go out and tackle these issues.
Absolutely.
And talk about them openly and to tell people where food comes from and to try and shock them into reality that mass-marketed food is not treated very well and doesn't even end up with a product that's worth even eating practically.
And your book, because I've seen this online now at Lulu, so just tell me a bit about that.
Oh, well, I set out, when I very first started my podcast, the Gastrocast, I tried to I thought I'd have enough time to keep it all in balance. And because I do the whole thing myself. It's a cooking show. It's about food, cooking, and the politics of what we eat. So not only is it just a cooking show, sort of how to prepare things, walk you through step by step, but also it's about politics of food and where it comes from and how to raise it yourself. So I've got a farming and gardening kind of flair to it as well. And I found that I outpaced my amount of time. So my pledge to my listeners was that I would give you a recipe with each show. I already provide a photo set of complete photos of the meal and preparation, because video podcasting wasn't around when I started podcasting. And so the Flickr photo set's there so they can go and reference that, and I include text with the photos. But I fell behind with the recipes, so I felt that I owed it to my listeners to come up with the photos and the recipes and the text in a cookbook. And so I originally did it as a digital copy only, free to the listeners, just to download and put on their machines and flip through it. It's a PDF file, and you go to my website and download it and look at the first 26 episodes of the Gastrocast. Each have a recipe for it. And pretty soon, a couple of my listeners said, hey, this isn't good enough. We want to buy the actual physical book and give it as gift. And so I found Lulu.com, which is a self-publishing place where you upload the files and they'll print the book on demand for you. Unfortunately, it's incredibly expensive that way for a lush color cookbook like mine. And I'm investigating ways of mass-producing the cookbook to get it cheaper. But for now, I've left it at Lulu. And it's got quite a good reception. I've had over 1,500 downloads when I stopped counting several months ago of the digital cookbook. And a number of people have bought the hard copy.
Fantastic. And so how do we get to find you? What's your website address?
My website, I've actually got two. The Gastrocast and the PodChef Empire can be found at www.podchef.motime.com. That's the blog for the Gastrocast. And then my business website for the Kitchen Garden Company can be found at www.kitchengardenfoods.com. And that's got, some more agricultural-related things, the bokashi, all my photos and blogging about bokashi and my experiences with, and the bokashi buckets for sale are all on the Kitchen Garden Company website.
Fantastic. Thank you. PodChef.
Thank you very much, Heather. You haven't got me started yet.
Thank you for that, Neil. He's a good old boy, that PodChef, isn't he? He's got some forthright ideas, but I like him.
Lots of celebrating controversy with PodChef. Next week, we're back to normal on the Wiggly Podcast, but that was great. Thank you, Neil, and bye from me.
And bye from me.